Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. On Sunday, China released a guideline on greater protection for property rights, featuring provisions for equal, comprehensive and law-based protection for all kinds of property, and encouraging the participation of the public in the process. The guideline was released by the State Council, the first time the top administration of the country has issued public guidance in these matters. So what property rights issues were covered in the guideline? How is the guideline likely to affect property protection in various sectors of China? And what are the challenges for its effective implementation? To discuss these and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Edward Lehman, Managing Director of the law firm Lehman, Lee & Xu, and He Jing, founder of Anjie Law Firm. But before we begin, let's take a look at this.
According to the guideline, the country will provide equal, comprehensive and law-based protection to all kinds of property rights and encourage the participation of the public in the process. China will further clarify the relations between owners and managers of state-owned property and push for equity diversification of state-owned enterprises and modern corporate governance of those companies. It states that property rights cases that remain unresolved due to historical reasons should be dealt with appropriately and an accountability system implemented to guard against improper court decisions. It further concludes that mechanisms should be improved to ensure that government at all levels be trustworthy and officials severely punished for breach of contract. Regulations on the expropriation of property are to be improved, and the scope of public interests should not be broadened, while compensation should be fair. The guideline also vows to intensify protection for intellectual property rights. Violators' credit records will be contaminated and the relevant punishment results will be made public. Policies should be upgraded to increase property income of urban and rural residents, and there will be further discussion on follow-up legal arrangements for the expiry of residential construction land use rights.
Gentlemen, skeptics and critics in the West complain that China has a lot to do to improve its rule of law, and therefore they question the public awareness about their own rights or protection of their rights. Now, with the release of this guideline by the State Council, what do you think of the importance for the protection of individual liberty and particularly their property rights?
So I personally think this guideline sets out a very broad framework which is going to be used to enhance the protection of property rights in China. You know, there's quite a lot of things in these guidelines. There, one of the things that everybody, get everybody's immediate attention is there's a possible work on this extension of the land use warrant. Right now it's 70 years for the residential rights. So now the government officially, it's the very first time they're talking about we are explore what are the great ideas to how to deal with the 70 years. This is a big thing in the minds of almost every a property owner, house owner in China.
Jing puts his finger on a very interesting point concerning public concerns about the 70-year land warrants.
Sure.
Because in China, or in the vocabulary of the Chinese, we don't have private ownership in the Western sense, and therefore the protection of property rights starts to dominate the front page stories for the Chinese. What do you think of the improvement, if any, of rule of law to guarantee the safety of your property rights?
Yeah, when you speak about property rights, it's a very large topic, and some might even say, some opinion leaders might say that the whole reason 1949 came out was about property rights. The idea of peasants not having property and landholders maybe misusing those rights, and so that's a very significant issue, and it's an economic issue with regards to, again, ascension. But property rights is a larger thing. It's creditors' rights, it's physical property rights, it's intellectual property rights. And what this message does, what happened on Sunday, might be perhaps the most significant thing that's come across. It sends a signal. It doesn't mean that the apparatus is in place yet to be able to handle this signal, but it says to the judiciary, it says to the people, it creates a certain amount of awareness that property rights are going to be put on the same level as government rights. quite often in China, a legal person, for example, isn't every single person. In other countries it might be, but in China it might not be. So this actually is a very strong signal. The rule of law is good. Somehow China works. But at the same time, there's going to have to be an adjustment throughout the system to make it actually function.
I'm afraid both of you have lived in this host country for a long time and old enough to understand the importance of public ownership, which is very much encouraged by the political institutions of the Communist Party. However, do you think the release of this guideline will step by step, or as part of the holistic campaign, to eventually lead to privatization of property rights?
I hope so, but it does require a lot of things, okay?
Maybe many of the Western viewers will be wondering a lot why you guys are talking about private ownership of the property, because in the West it's taken for granted that of course you have the private ownership.
Well, I think we have our own history. You know, we have honor or respect a part of a history. But as everybody knows, as we develop the market economy, as the size of the economy of China grows so much, and the government, the legislature, the court has to improve or has to really provide the consistency and the predictability for the whole system. Otherwise, it would disempower the individuals, the enterprise owner, and even some of the very large state-owned enterprises to really operate on the
Jim,
ground.
you know, you addressed the very core issue of rule of law, meaning how to promote the transparency, the sunshine transparency of whatever policy roadmap of the government. What do you think of his concern as a professional lawyer?
No, I agree. Listen, the laws, policies, and regulations that exist are well written, well identified. The implementation of those is the struggle, and it's not some sinister plot. I mean, we have 200,000 lawyers in the People's Republic of China, which is 5 times the population of the United States. The United States has 1.3 million lawyers. And so the apparatus that's operating here in Beijing with the legal system could be different, certainly from Gansu or from Xinjiang. And so it's a very large place that you have to try to get all of these instruments and all these people in pulling the same oar. So the rule of law obviously can be clarified, but under a civil law system, it has to be interpretation by the local government officials, which can make it uneven. And I think this is where there's been some issues of complaint.
With the growing momentum in the high-handed anti-graft campaign throughout the whole country, with Xi Jinping taking the public office 4 years ago, how do you look at the methods employed by governments at different levels to deal with the illegal assets confiscated as a result of the anti-corruption campaign?
You know, there were some controversies. In the past few years, there were quite a few big cases where either private enterprise owner was sent to jail for illegal financing activities. Now, there were lots of discussions that the assets, even the lawful assets, were probably not so appropriately dealt with, you know, putting it a nicer way. That's triggered many people to really argue, hey, whether there's a due process in dealing with the sort of bad people's assets. Nowadays, people sort of understand we don't really use this, this label, hey, whether you're bad or good. If you're a bad person, then we take everything away from you. But now people know that, hey, we're all humans and they have their rights. Even people who are staying in the jail, they have their own rights. Those things need to be done in due process or in appropriate ways. So this is very clearly in this guidelines. I think to give some credit to the government, this is guidelines probably meant to give some peace of mind for everyone. Mm-hmm. China, the economy is the whole society, the whole economy is changed or evolved so much in the past decades. And things are complicated, are sophisticated. And they were, in China, the scholars using the word like original sin to describe some of the early successful people have encountered in terms of legal problem, whether the first bucket goat is problematic or not. Now, if the system is not involved in a way that everybody feels like everything they have earned for so many years can be taken away overnight, that will put everybody in a very comfortable situation. So in some of the countries, we know they declare like this immunity right?
I'm
Overnight.
you know, Jing, I'm a little bit surprised that you can put yourself in the shoes of politicians with regard to how to maintain social stability and particularly confidence of consumers and investors at this critical moment of
is this all
new
about
normal.
that?
Because if you cannot protect the rights or property rights, then people would gradually develop a feeling of insecurity, and they would, of course, add to the outbound flight of the capital, and that will further lead to the internal bleeding of the economy.
Sure. I mean, when you look at, again, one of the reasons why the property prices and the property issues are so acute is that the RMB does not float. So money must remain in the country to a large extent, generally speaking. And so that this money is going into real estate and real property. And then the future of the economy and the growth of the economy is based upon the value of that. If the leaseholds were to expire, the warrants would then come back and it would go to the state. That could go down to zero. But I think one thing I just want to point out about property, it's a little bit deceptive. So in America, we call it holding something in fee simple, which means you own it forever. But that's not really true. If you don't pay your taxes, then the government will take that property away from you. And we have issues of eminent domain. They came up with Trump, him saying, their opponents of Mr. Trump saying that he was taking property by eminent domain in order to build out his developments and not paying attention to what people's rights were. So these issues are not indicative just of China, and I think what people don't understand is you rent the property or lease the property underneath it generally when you're high rise, and you so-called own the actual four corners of the building. So there has to be some give and take. But these issues are time sensitive right now.
Given the unique political institutions of this country since 1949 when the PRC was founded, people, particularly in recent years, like Professor Zhang Weiying, Xu Xiaonian, and Mr. have been calling for the absolute and unconditional protection of the non-public sector of the economy. They strongly encourage the market to play the decisive role in reallocating resources. At the same time, they have been very critical of the government's role in handling micro control. So, in other words, they are not very happy about the industrial policy of the government. It is within this general and broad context that the release of this guidance serves to engineer equal protection of the property rights. What do you think of the importance of having equal and law-based comprehensive protection of the property rights?
Oh, it's a maturity. It's really maturity of the system. And people used to have sort of a naive way of looking at assets. If we go back to the history, we put our label on landowners. We think they're bad. Okay, that's why the assets need to be taken away. But now with all the growth of the economy, there got to be have the rule of law, have the due process. If you want to take away somebody's assets, you have to go through the procedures. The person or the company has committed like a crime, something like clearly stated in the law. Okay, and then you go through the right procedures, and they got to have the right lawyer. They have to have the defense. So once all this is being said, or fulfilled, then that person's property can be taken away. And
we do have a course. We do have a big army of lawyers. But what do you think of the issue of a presumption of guilt?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating thing that was in this document. So you're not to be presumed guilty. In this particular document and what's come out from all different sources from the government. But so that is a real blockbuster of a situation, which really goes back into the point that you can, if something that you've done perhaps is illegal in your business, doesn't mean that every single thing that's attached to your business will automatically be confiscated. And so that's a really significant signal, I think, that there has to be a certain amount of flexibility. Under the civil law system, and I think a lot of people don't understand this that are in common law countries, is that sometimes it's form over function. So you might not file a document and that would be considered to be not appropriate, and that would make the business cease not to exist. In common law jurisdictions, it's presumed that it's okay to do that way. And so what they're saying here is that the presumption of innocence and the right to a lawyer and everything else would attach with these property rights, which is so important because there's been so big publicity.
Right. The presumption of innocence is in the law. It's in our criminal code. Just to be clear, right?
Okay.
But the fact that the guideline emphasize this which shows that probably we're not that perfect in the practice. This part of indeed the practice.
Euphemism or understatement about wide margin for improvement of, the issue
I think the government
presumption of
definitely
guilt.
clearly recognize this.
Does it mean that we are learning from the West with a strong sense of humility? Because China could not boast of, rule of law until recent years when the market economy is growing so fast, and the idea of a level playing field between public and non-public sectors of the economy got to be treated on equal footing, and therefore we have this growing public awareness about protection of their property rights.
I don't think it's necessarily like a learning from the West. I call that we are now really following the logic itself. Really.
Common sense. Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with He Jing and Edward Lehman. We're discussing implications of the latest release of the guidelines by the State Council about how to better protect property rights. That is increasingly an important issue for those who need to have a strong sense of security to sustain the healthy economic reform and growth in this country. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Yeah, gentlemen, welcome back. We've been discussing equal protection, comprehensive and law-based protection of our property rights. Here is a tragic case. Mr. Jia Jinglong, a villager from Hebei province, was executed for murdering a local official out of a revenge after his home was forcibly demolished, triggering public outrage toward home demolitions and relocations by coercive force. Now, the guideline also vows to complete the legal system for land and house expropriation, detailing the legal rights and procedures during requisition and clarifying the scope, type, and standard of a compensation. This has been front-page stories for the social media, for state-run media for a long time. The image of Chen Guan has been seriously demonized as a result of this forcible demolition. What do you think of the wake-up call for such a tragedy, the death penalty for Jia Jinglong, in the context of this guideline?
I think the Jia Jinglong case and also the calling in this guidelines for the better protection of the private ownership really shows that in China, we are in a very critical moment. China has been growing so fast. We made this amazing infrastructure construction projects for the past decades, and the government's been relatively have a lot of liberty, and which also cooperated by the most of the private system in terms of giving away the land for the large amount of development projects, whether it's the high-speed railway, whether it's a big bridge, or it's a large property developments, and that's actually make it work. We do not. You never seen like China has a big dispute on the land and stop any big the property developments. Now, after all these years of development, I think the Chinese citizens, the awareness of private ownership is now really point that, well, we're not going to allow somebody taking away my land so easily. Even if you pay me something.
Dr. Jing skillfully and shrewdly averted the sensitive issue of the death penalty, or reviewed the death penalty by the Supreme People's Court. This is a very important part of the tragedy. Now, he is talking about the protection of property rights of an individual farmer. Now, that the high-speed development of infrastructure, which is a hallmark of China's economic success, is actually based on the cost of disadvantaged social groups' well-being, such as Jia Jinglong, one of the victims of such a forcible demolition. And he, of course, it's wrong. It's a crime for him to kill the village head. What do you think of, something that India has envied for a long while? You know what I mean. Indians have strong media, independence of the judiciary, a lot of lobby groups who protect the rights of farmers and the weak social groups. In sharp contrast, China has somehow sacrificed the rights of the property owners to pave a way for the construction of infrastructure.
Well, I'm not sure that Mr. He
this
was
is highly controversial.
Yeah, the issue is with regards to murdering another human being in revenge. I mean, that's vigilantism. I mean, you can't. It may have been for what he thought, this person who's been condemned to death, a just cause. However, you just can't go around and kill people. I mean, there has to be some rule of law, so it goes back to that. So I understand the government, and I understand the steps, that sort of thing should not be promoted.
I'm afraid people like Jia Jinlong in the United States could
Sure.
be protected by the Second Amendment, by bearing firearms and shoot whoever who want to forcibly demolish their properties. But in China, this is absolutely insane, absolutely crime.
That's right. I mean, in the United States,
Right.
for example, I mean, we have homesteading as well, which, I mean, in the state of Florida, you lose all your money, you lose everything, you're completely bankrupt. They cannot take your home away from you if it's your primary residence. So in the United States, that is considered to be sacred in some jurisdictions, and also the idea of defending your home, and this has been in the press over the last year, that you don't have the right even to retreat. You can actually shoot people, you know, as long as they're coming towards you. So
Yeah,
I mean,
I think the public emotion about this Jia Jinlong's case is probably lesser about what's really going on at the case. It's probably more about the sense of protecting people's home. And now with the Chinese people, now even average people having so much assets, you know, even in Beijing, right?
Property, yeah, I
right.
mean, multiple properties, many throughout the country, so they need to be protected.
Yeah, and then now even think about, now this is a private system. Now think about a company, a very successful company, maybe listed company. I mean, the owner and the whole, so many employees, right? The company management, the shareholders have such a huge amount of assets. Now the sense of the security, I think is bigger than ever at this moment. I think right now the government issued these policy guidelines are really at the right timing. You know, it could even come even earlier. So that give a big sense of the peace of mind, as I described, for our enterprise owners, for the citizens.
No, exactly. But we're not even only talking about just physical property. We're also talking about intellectual property. We're also talking about creditors' rights. We're also talking about blacklisting people who are, trolls or squatters. I mean, this is sort of vaguely hinted in this legislation or this announcement. So, I mean, this is a huge kind of aspect. For example, when the trademarks law was first written here, it said that Chinese had the rights to be able to file a trademark, when indeed they actually didn't. They weren't permitted under the system to be able to file that. It had to be a company, and they were trying to, in their wisdom, and this goes back to the case, the government is standing there like a father or a mother as a parent and trying to say what's best for the country. And there's some difficult choices to be made from any country. And so it's easy to look in hindsight to say, well, we shouldn't have stopped, we should have given peasants or displaced people their rights at this point in time. But we're here now, and the situation is now, and they're being realistic on how to move forward because the economy must grow. They actually also, the party also has to look to be able to make this a rule of law and not a party issue only. It has to be left to the lawyers, left to the administrators, left to the people individually to make these directions.
To ask the next question, let me begin with introduction of broad context. In fact, with the devastating financial crisis back in the year 2008, the Chinese government started to introduce the idea of a supply-side restructuring, which means we have to upgrade the high value added service in the process of urbanization, in the spirit of innovation, which means clearly we need to protect intellectual property rights because we not only import high-tech developed nations like Germany, which is seriously concerned about the violation of IPR. We also we come across as the biggest number of copyright applications.
Patent filings. Yeah, that's right.
So
some 40%.
we are victim of not only IPR violations, we also encourage the protection of this, the homegrown patent application. So what do you think of the challenges in the protection of IPR, I mean intellectual property rights?
Well, that's exactly about the property. For the last almost 10 years, I've been advocating for the criminal enforcement against the counterfeiting activities. There was some very fabulous discussion about the criminal liability of the counterfeiting activities. People probably don't know about this. There is a criminal liability in China against the counterfeiters, but what's really interesting is the name of crime is called the crime against market order, socialist market order. If you really think about it, something's wrong here because trademark, the IP right, is supposed to be about the property. So counterfeiting is supposed to be a crime against property. It's not a crime against the market order. So there are some subtleties about this. Actually, there's a huge difference when it comes down to, how you're gonna prosecute a crime against the property, or there's a crime against the market order. So for years, we've been trying to advocate that China should amend the criminal code such that counterfeiters should be liable as a crime against the property, not some market order. That's much lighter. So we're hoping that with the spirit of these guidelines, something can be done. Then the criminal law can be really used effectively against the counterfeiter. That will really change the
But gentlemen, to be
reality.
honest, are you really confident about the execution of the guidelines? For years we've been talking about rule of law, which covers several stages along the way down social development. For example, legislation, law enforcement, and of course education of the general public about legal awareness or litigation. So which is the most important, or is being featured prominently by the media about rule of law?
Well, what's most important to me is civil procedure, so that everything is exactly fair for everyone else. And this is sort of my pet peeve when I've been in Chinese courts and seen how it's working. So it's not always equal. Some things it's more equal than others, in different cases. But this becomes very difficult to try to implement when you talk about an entire country. So it might work here in civil procedure, but would it work in an outlying place or a province? But you're right. I mean, God is in the details. The devil is in the details. Whatever it is since we have it, this is the starting of the process, and then it's going to be a long slog.
So it's not just the job of the legislation, the courts, and the lawyers, but it's also commitment and mandate of the media to strengthen the oversight,
I think
so
this is
that
definitely
execution can be done properly and justice can be done.
I think this one actually something lots of aspects in this policy guidelines have something to do with implementation. The one big deal would be the institutional design. And for example, let's take the IP as example as well. In this one, they're talking about the IP court. China actually probably lots of people have not realized that China really have a specialized IP courts. Okay, it's not a perfect system, but it's starting to give something to protect the IP. But we need more of this. We need more of the institutional design to really protect the property. It's actually, you mentioned, well, we need a legislature, we need the lawyers. It's not a really small thing, if the government really allowed the lawyers to play a big job.
This is a major step in the correct direction. Thank you very much for your participation in this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. From all of us here on the team, goodbye.